She stood in the kitchen doorway and said it evenly, like she had practiced the sentence until all the feeling was gone. She said she needed space. I agreed and watched everything shift. For a second, I thought I had heard her wrong. Not because the words were unclear, but because of how clean they sounded. Too smooth. Too finished. Like the conversation had already happened somewhere else, and I was only getting my turn to listen to it. I didn't argue. Didn't ask who she had rehearsed it with, or how long she'd been carrying it around before setting it down in front of me. I just nodded once, turned toward the hall closet, and reached up to the top shelf. The suitcase was exactly where we always kept it. That small fact bothered me more than what she said. Everything in that kitchen still looked normal. Her coffee mug was in the sink. My keys were on the counter beside a folded receipt from the grocery store. The plant by the window leaned toward the weak Portland light like it had every morning for the last 3 years. Nothing in the room matched the sentence she had just spoken. I pulled the suitcase down and set it on the floor. When I unzipped it, the sound was too loud for such a quiet conversation. A long, rough pull through the silence. It made her shift her weight in the doorway. Then she took one step back. I noticed that, not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It was small, instinctive, like she expected something from me now that the line had been delivered. Anger, questions, negotiation, some version of the man who still believed there was something left here to protect. I didn't give her any of that. I bent down, opened the suitcase, and started thinking in practical terms. Shirts, jeans, charger, work laptop. She stayed where she was, arms folded, watching me like she wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or unsettled. I never asked her to repeat herself. I had heard enough. Before that morning, everything about our life looked stable from the outside, predictable in the way people aim for without saying it out loud. We lived in Portland, in a quiet apartment that stayed warm in the winter and let in just enough gray light to make mornings feel slow instead of heavy. I worked as an engineer. Long hours, clean problems, measurable outcomes. She worked at a marketing firm downtown. Faster pace, more people, more language around ideas than results. Our mornings followed the same pattern. Coffee first. Always coffee. I made it while she checked her phone, scrolling through emails or messages that had come in overnight. We'd exchange a few sentences, nothing deep, just enough to acknowledge the day had started. Plans, timing, who'd be home first. Then we'd leave within minutes of each other. It worked. Not exciting, but solid. When she told me about the new team at work, she sounded energized in a way I hadn't seen in a while. New leadership, new structure, new direction. She talked about collaboration, creative freedom, people who thought differently. I remember nodding, genuinely glad she had something that pulled her forward like that. At first, the changes were small. She started using different phrases in conversation. Words that didn't belong to us. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. Personal boundaries. Emotional labor. Space within a relationship. They showed up casually at first, like something she picked up during the day and brought home without thinking. I didn't push back. There didn't seem to be anything to push against. People change how they talk when their environment changes. I saw it on job sites all the time. New crew, new habits, new language. It didn't mean anything by itself. She'd sit across from me at the table and explain something she'd discussed at work, framing it like an idea worth considering. I listened. Sometimes I agreed. Sometimes I didn't say much at all. It felt temporary, like she was trying on a different way of thinking, seeing how it fit before deciding whether to keep it. I didn't see a reason to challenge it. There was no conflict yet. No clear line where things shifted from normal to something else. Looking back, that's the part that stands out. Not what changed, but how easy it was to believe that small changes didn't mean anything at all. The phrases didn't disappear. They repeated. At first, I didn't notice the repetition as a problem. People circle back to ideas when they're still figuring them out. That's normal. But this was different. The wording didn't change. The structure didn't shift. It was the same sentences, delivered at different times, in different conversations, with the same tone and the same conclusions. Like they had been finalized somewhere else. I started catching it in small moments. She'd bring something up at dinner, frame it like a realization, and halfway through I'd recognize it. Not the idea, but the exact phrasing. Word for word from something she'd said days earlier. I didn't interrupt her. I let her finish. Then I waited. The next time it happened, I paid closer attention. Not to what she meant, but to how she said it. Where she paused. Which word she emphasized. It was consistent in a way that didn't feel natural. It felt practiced. Our conversations shifted without either of us announcing it. They stopped being about us, about schedules, plans, small disagreements, and started orbiting around broader concepts. Systems, roles, balance, power. The kind of language that sounds objective on the surface but always lands somewhere personal. Except it didn't feel like it belonged to either of us. I remember one night clearly. She was standing by the counter, explaining something about control dynamics in relationships. Not accusing me directly, not pointing to anything specific, just outlining it, calmly, like she was presenting a case study. I stood there and listened. And for the first time, I had the thought without trying to soften it. This isn't coming from her. Not originally. That didn't make it less real. If anything, it made it clearer. Patterns don't need emotion to be consistent. They just need repetition. So I stopped reacting to the surface of what she was saying. I started listening for structure, where the ideas began, how they developed, where they ended. And once I started paying attention that way, the randomness disappeared. What looked like scattered conversations was actually a sequence. The same points, introduced in the same order, leading to the same conclusions. Not spontaneous. Designed. That's when it stopped feeling like a phase and started feeling like a pattern I could map. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. By the time she said she needed space, the meaning was already clear. Not because she explained it well, but because everything leading up to it had already narrowed the definition. The repetition, the structure, the way each conversation moved in the same direction, regardless of where it started. Space wasn't a pause. It was a position. I stood there in the kitchen, suitcase open on the floor, and let that settle without resistance. There was no sudden realization, no sharp emotional drop. Just a quiet alignment between what I had been observing and what she was now saying out loud. I didn't feel the need to clarify it with her. I already understood. That was the point where something in me shifted, not outwardly, not in a way she could see, but internally, in a way that removed urgency from everything. The need to explain, to correct, to bring the conversation back to something shared. I had spent weeks, maybe longer, assuming that if I stayed steady, if I didn't escalate, things would eventually return to something familiar. That assumption ended there. Not with anger, not with disappointment, with absence. I stopped looking for the version of her that used to meet me halfway. Stopped measuring her words against what we used to be. The comparison itself didn't make sense anymore. It required a baseline that no longer existed. She was still standing in the doorway, watching me pack. Waiting. I could feel it without looking directly at her. The expectation that I would push back, question her timing, ask what space actually meant in practical terms. How long? What rules? What changed and what didn't? I didn't ask any of it, because none of those answers would have altered the outcome. I folded a shirt, placed it into the suitcase, and moved on to the next one. The process was simple, repetitive, contained. Each item had a place. Each movement had a purpose. There was a kind of control in that, not over the situation, over my response to it. I realized then that there was nothing left to negotiate. Not because I had decided that, but because the structure had already been built without me. The terms had been formed somewhere else, reinforced through repetition, and delivered only when they were complete. All that was left for me was whether I would participate in it. I chose not to. Not by refusing, by stepping out of it entirely. Something closed at that moment, quietly, without force, and once it did, there was no sense in trying to reopen it. After that morning, I stopped thinking in terms of conversations. I started thinking in terms of information. Not aggressively, not obsessively, just consistently. The same way I would approach a problem at work, quietly collecting inputs before deciding what they meant. I didn't need everything at once. I just needed enough to understand the structure behind it. The first thing I changed was how I paid attention. Not to what she told me directly, but to what existed around it. She left her tablet on the kitchen counter more often than she used to. Not intentionally, just without the same level of awareness. Notifications would light up the screen, names I recognized only because they appeared repeatedly. Nicole, Tess. At first, they were just names. Then they became patterns. The messages weren't hidden. Not exactly. They were just assumed to be unimportant to me. Conversations opened mid-thread, fragments visible without context. But fragments are enough if you know what you're looking for. I didn't scroll through everything. I didn't need to. I read what was already there. Short exchanges. Structured. Efficient. She said this today. Good. Next step is to hold the line. Don't over-explain. Let him sit with it. There was no emotion in the way it was written. No hesitation. Just direction. Adjustment. Confirmation. I recognized the phrasing immediately, because I had already heard it. The sentences she used with me had appeared there first, almost unchanged. Same words. Same order. Delivered to me later like they had formed naturally in her own thoughts. They hadn't. That was the moment the pattern stopped being theoretical. It became visible. I didn't confront her. There was nothing to gain from that. Confrontation would only collapse the surface level, not the structure underneath. And I wasn't interested in surface anymore. I was interested in accuracy. So I started remembering things. Dates. Times. What was said and when. Which phrases appeared first in those messages, and how long it took before I heard them directly. It wasn't difficult. Once you see a pattern, your mind holds on to it without effort. The delay was consistent. Hours, sometimes a day. Enough time for something to be introduced, refined, then delivered. I didn't take screenshots right away. I didn't need proof for her. I needed clarity for myself. And the clearer it became, the quieter I got. Not distant. Not cold. Just no longer participating in something I hadn't been part of building in the first place. At some point, it stopped being personal. Not in the sense that it didn't affect me anymore. It did. Just not in a way that required a reaction from her. What I was seeing extended past our apartment, past our conversations, past whatever version of us had existed before this started. It had a framework. The messages from Nicole and Tess weren't isolated. They referenced other conversations, other situations, other outcomes. It wasn't just advice, it was coordination. Language repeated across different threads, applied to different people, adjusted slightly depending on context, but always leading in the same direction. That was the part that changed how I approached it. I stopped looking at it as something happening to me. I started looking at it as something being implemented. Their posts were public. Not all of them, but enough. Short statements. Clean phrasing. Ideas presented as general principles, detached from any specific situation but structured in a way that made them easy to apply. I recognized entire lines from those posts in the way she spoke to me. Not similar. Identical. I didn't need to guess where it came from anymore. So I began collecting things properly. Not obsessively. Not in a way that would raise questions. Just methodically. Screenshots when they mattered. Dates attached to them. Context added later, when I had time to sit and align everything. I built a simple structure. Message. Delay. Delivery. Outcome. Once I started placing events into that sequence, the gaps disappeared. What felt confusing before became predictable. Not because I knew what she would say next, but because I understood how it would be constructed. At the same time, I shifted focus to things that didn't involve her at all. Accounts. Access. Documents. I reviewed everything we shared without making changes yet. Just understanding where everything was, how it was organized, what depended on what. The same way I would map out a system before modifying it. There was no urgency. That was important. Rushing would have meant I was still reacting. I wasn't. I was aligning. I contacted a lawyer quietly. No dramatic meeting, no long explanation. Just a conversation focused on process. What needed to be in place before anything changed. What order things should happen in to avoid unnecessary complications. It was straightforward. Structure always is, once you remove emotion from it. Back at home, nothing looked different. She still moved through the apartment the same way. Same routines. Same tone. Same expectation that I was still engaging with everything at face value. I didn't correct that assumption. There was no benefit to it. The more consistent everything appeared, the easier it was to finish what I needed to finish without interference. By then, I wasn't waiting for anything to resolve. I was preparing for it to end in a way that didn't require explanation. A week after she said she needed space, she brought it up again. Not in the same tone. Not as clean. We were in the living room. Late evening. The kind of quiet that usually fills itself with small talk, background noise, something neutral to keep things from settling too deeply. This time, it didn't. She stood near the edge of the room, not quite sitting, not quite leaving. Maybe I went too far, she said. The sentence didn't land the way the first one had. It wasn't structured. It didn't sound rehearsed. There was hesitation in it, small, but enough to notice. I didn't respond right away. I let the silence hold for a few seconds longer than normal. Not to make a point, just to see if she would continue without being prompted. She didn't. So I looked at her, steady, the same way I had been looking at everything else for the past week, waiting for the rest of it. It didn't come. That was the first time I realized she was expecting something different from me. Not agreement. Not resistance. A reaction. The version of me she had been preparing for. The one who would ask what she meant. Who would open the conversation back up, give her space to explain, adjust, reposition. Something she could work with. Something that fit into the structure she was used to operating within. I didn't give her that. I kept it simple. I understand. That was it. No follow-up. No clarification. No attempt to expand the moment into something larger than it was. Her expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, but enough to register. Like she had stepped onto something expecting resistance and found nothing there. "Is that all?" she asked. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was uncertain. I nodded once. There wasn't anything else to add. Because by then, the conversation itself didn't carry weight for me anymore. It wasn't where decisions were being made. It wasn't where anything was being defined. That had already happened. She stood there for a few seconds longer, like she was waiting for something to reopen. When it didn't, she turned slightly, looking around the room without focusing on anything in particular. The space between us felt different. Not tense, just unconnected. Whatever adjustment she was trying to make, it didn't reach me. And I could see, in that moment, that she knew it. After that, things didn't escalate. They moved. Not fast. Not dramatically. Just forward, in a way that didn't require either of us to acknowledge it out loud. The conversations became shorter, then less frequent, then unnecessary. At home, the apartment settled into a kind of quiet that didn't feel temporary. She stopped bringing things up. I stopped waiting for her to. What I had put in motion outside of that space continued without interruption. The email to HR was structured the same way everything else had been. Clean, direct, supported. No accusations. Just information. Dates. Screenshots. Public posts aligned with internal behavior. Enough to initiate a review without turning it into something emotional. I sent it early in the morning. By the afternoon, there was a response. Not detailed. Just confirmation that the material had been received and would be evaluated. I didn't follow up. There was no need. Processes like that don't require pressure. They require clarity. Once they start, they move according to their own structure. A few days later, the first change appeared. Nicole was gone. Not announced publicly. Just absent. Her name stopped appearing in the internal threads I had access to. Her posts disappeared shortly after. Accounts deactivated. Content removed. It was quiet. Efficient. Test lasted a little longer. Long enough for the pattern to repeat once more before it broke. Then the same thing happened. No announcement. No explanation. Just absence where there had previously been consistency. At home, none of that was discussed. She didn't mention them. But I could see the shift. Not in what she said. In what she didn't. The language changed again. The phrases that had once repeated so precisely stopped appearing. Conversations lost their structure. Not chaotic, just incomplete. Like something had been removed without being replaced. She moved through the apartment more slowly. Not physically, but in decision. Pauses where there hadn't been pauses before. Small hesitations in routine. The system she had been operating within wasn't there anymore. And without it, there was nothing holding the previous pattern together. One evening, she stood in the kitchen longer than usual, looking at her phone without interacting with it. Just holding it, like she was waiting for something that wasn't coming. I passed through the room without stopping. Not avoiding her, just continuing. The quiet between us deepened, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was final. By then, everything that needed to unfold had already begun doing so. Without input, without resistance, without me needing to be part of it anymore. She told me she wanted to fix it on a Tuesday. Not announced. Not prepared. Just said, quietly, like she was placing something fragile on the table between us. "I think we can still fix this." I was sitting at the counter, going through a set of documents I had already reviewed twice before. Not because they needed it, but because repetition keeps things clean. No gaps. No missed details. I didn't look up immediately. Not to dismiss her. Just to finish the line I was reading before shifting focus. When I did look at her, she was standing in the same place she had stood the first morning. Kitchen doorway. Same posture. But everything else was different. There was no structure behind what she was saying now. No sequence. No reinforcement. Just her. I nodded once. Not in agreement. In acknowledgement. I believe you mean that, I said. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't cold. It was accurate. Because I did believe it. Whatever had been guiding her before was gone, and what remained was unfiltered, unstructured, real in a way that hadn't been present for weeks. But reality, on its own, doesn't reverse outcomes. She took a step forward, slower this time. We can take time. Start over. Do this differently. The words were simpler than before. No terminology. No framing. Just intent. I listened. Fully. The way I had listened to everything else. Then I closed the folder in front of me and placed it flat on the counter. Aligned with the edge. Straight. There's nothing to go back to, I said. My tone didn't change. Same level. Same pace. That was the part she didn't expect. Not rejection. Finality. Her expression held for a second, like she was trying to adjust the moment into something workable. Something that allowed for movement, for negotiation, for a different outcome if the right words were used. There weren't any. Not anymore. I'm not angry, I added. And I'm not trying to make a point. That mattered. Because it removed the idea that this was a reaction. It wasn't. It was a conclusion. She looked at me for a long time after that. Not searching for an answer. Just realizing there wasn't one left to find. I didn't explain further. Didn't list reasons. Didn't reference anything I had seen, read, or documented. None of it was necessary. Everything that mattered had already happened. And whatever she was offering now, even if it was genuine, didn't connect to what had already been decided. Not by me. By the structure that had been built long before that conversation. I picked the folder back up and continued where I left off. Not to dismiss her, just to continue. Because for me, it was already over. And there was nothing left to repair. Now the apartment is quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty or unfinished. There's no tension in it. No expectation that something is about to be said, or fixed, or explained. Just space, settled into itself. Most of her things are gone. Not all at once. Gradually. A few boxes at a time, taken without conversation. Each absence noticeable for a moment, then absorbed into the room like it had always been that way. I didn't track what she took. There was no need. What mattered wasn't in those boxes. The routines changed without resistance. Coffee in the morning, still the same. The light through the window, still gray and steady. The difference is that nothing in the room feels temporary anymore. There's no waiting. That's what I noticed most. Before, even when things looked stable, there was always an underlying sense that something needed to be maintained. Adjusted. Protected. That's gone. What's left is simple. Work. Time. Quiet. Not as a pause. Not as something leading to the next version of the same thing. Just as it is. And for the first time in a while, that's enough. That's the end of this story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos on screen for you. Pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.